Thank you. It's great to be here. It's really been a treat to be in such a diverse audience, a different one than where I normally hang out. I'm actually trained as a chemist. I wanted to have a really snappy title for this talk, but as you can see, this is what you get when you ask a scientist for something. We love our technical jargon, all our really obtuse language, the qualifiers that mean so much to the data that we have, and of course we have a deep and meaningful relationship with the passive voice. Um, in contrast, this is how NGOs communicate, and I spent a lot of my career working either on the issues side, which is a nice way for saying that we're playing defense, or more on sustainability, which is more optimistic. I never got to use anything as clever and irreverent as, hey, FDA, bite me, as a message, and never will. That would not be appropriate for a private sector company, nor would we ever get away with an irreverent sort of act of defiance like planting scary corn on the lawn of the Reichstag. But you can see why NGOs can be so effective. They have very clever, compact, concise ways that they engage people. And that's not to say that they don't have scientists and scientists that underpin their positions, but they don't lead with that. In contrast, I worked for a science and technology company. I'm a scientist. Almost everybody that works in the company is a scientist or an engineer. And we had this view that science will prevail. We're going to do the very best scientists. It's going to be really rigorous. We're going to put it out there. And eventually, if we just are patient, this will sort its way out. This is kind of like the pre-Copernicus view of the solar system. And needless to say, it became very obvious early in my career that this was not going to work. So one of the problems is that actually a lot of this isn't science. We wrap it up in the cloak of science, but it's not science at all. There's nothing scientific about deciding that 1 in a million cancer risk is okay. There isn't a place in science really for value-laden judgments. If I do a life cycle assessment and I map material and energy flows all the way from when it comes out of the ground or it's harvested through production, use phase to end of life, and you do it across these different categories, and somebody says, well, you need to tell me which is better. It depends on what's most important to you. Is it greenhouse gases, ozone depletion, water? That's a value judgment that science can't answer. Science doesn't prove negatives, and in fact, if I want to be really fussy about this, what science does is it disproves things. It doesn't actually prove anything at all, and yet when we communicate to people, that's what they want. They want something declarative and definitive that's going to tell them what they're going to do. And this is part of why you have this back and forth, guys. It's good for you. No, it's bad. Well, maybe it's okay. And it really confuses people, and they start to disengage. And needless to say, science is a messy process. It will, over time, I do believe, oscillate its way to a proper consensus for the knowledge of the time. But again, that's very disconcerting to people. So early in my time, this evolved to a view that science is necessary but not sufficient. You don't necessarily lead with the science. You've got to package this up in a way that it's more digestible, it's more understandable, it's more engaging. And there are a variety of techniques. You folks know all of these. Whether it's the infographic, where we take all of this information and we just package it up in a way that people can better engage with. Maybe we talk about all of the different initiatives that we're trying to use and the partners we're working with to tackle something. Maybe we distill it down into the really one key message people care about, 1,000 times below government safety limits. But I'd like to talk a little bit about one that we did, and I take no credit for the idea, it's execution. I showed up essentially when it was ready for use, and that was the chlorine tree. This came out of the days of the Ban Chlorine campaign. Anybody remember Chlorine Free in '93? Tagline, like I said, they have great messaging. This is not what any professional communicator would ever advise you to create. It was a big sheet of paper. It had a tree on it, and off of it were all of these branches leading to products upon which chlorine was dependent. It literally required a magnifying glass to use. The fonts were so small, but all of a sudden you would lay this down. Usually I was working with policymakers, and you'd say, did you really want to ban gallium arsenide? Because that's underneath all of the electronics upon which we depend. Did you really mean to ban chlorine and get rid of these medicines? As you watched people work through this tree, they would sometimes come onto those things that were more significant, or they'd start to look at things that were almost kind of trivial, like guitar strings, or their toothpaste, or the seat they're sitting in. But all of a sudden, they would start to step back, and they could see this mysterious building block of my industry in their life. And you could now start to have a different conversation. I really do think this ability to listen first and understand where they're coming from is the only way you ever get them to listen to the science that you're bringing to the table. The other evolution, I would say, over the course of my career, from businesses and business leaders that said, we don't need regulation. We're smart, we're technically capable, we know how to do this, just leave us alone. To, we actually need regulation. Regulation inspires trust and confidence in people that don't trust us and never will. Regulation deals with laggards who will not behave responsibly and can't be trusted. There are a number of values that regulations play. I will say I've seen a regulation, or I've never seen a regulation that didn't have a good intent that I would support. They've always been a little cumbersome when it comes to implementation. And finally, I wouldn't advocate this for a lot of the issues that you folks deal with, vaccine safety, climate change, but in business, you really need to know when to walk away. Sometimes science is not going to win the day, and you just need to move on and do something different. I would submit that we're in another transition to where science has a role. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all of decision-making. In fact, there are a lot of questions it actually can't answer. But I do think it can play a part. Science can inform the choices that we make. It can predict likely outcomes. It can highlight the limitations of what we know. It can articulate assumptions, which frankly, often people don't realize are assumptions at all, that there's no data underpinning that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to be conscious about that. It can reduce uncertainty, and science can actually respond with innovations. You saw this a lot in refrigerants, where you've had, I think they're on about the 4th or 5th generation of refrigerants. Initial ones, ozone depleting. Next generation turned out to have high global warming potentials. If you send these signals out of wanting something different, science can respond with that. I would encourage, and when I say policy, I don't just mean public policy, but also policy that gets set in corporations, which often moves much, much faster than government ever will, is to use a weight of evidence. In the space I spent a lot of my career in, chemicals management, we set risk assessments very often off of a single study. There might be dozens of studies, and we pick one. It might not be the most robust one. It might not be the best designed one, but that's the one we ultimately use and derive our regulatory scheme off of. Let's leverage data. This is really, really important in life cycle assessment where data gaps are massive. That's not to say don't do the assessment. Leverage the data you have and make the best of it, and hopefully it gives you an indicative result of where maybe you should focus. Insist on peer-reviewed studies. There's tons of problems in the peer-reviewed literature. You folks that are in academia know that better than I do. But we've got to have some sort of system that at least puts some level of scrutiny and critique on the information that we use. Take a life cycle view. Nothing drives me crazy than seeing an advertisement that says this is a zero-emission vehicle. Well, no, it's not zero-emission vehicle. It may be zero-emission vehicle out the tailpipe that doesn't exist, but those emissions are somewhere else. Let's take a holistic view and let's make conscious decisions about things. And finally, it would be really wonderful if we could be sending signals into the private sector about what we want versus focusing on restricting or banning what we don't want. And my final plea, I guess, is let's make sure we're actually trying to address a scientific problem if we want to put science against it. I would say if I switch from a solar system metaphor to one of a jigsaw puzzle, each of us has a piece of the puzzle, whether it's a policy piece, or it's a communications piece, or it's a business piece, or it's a community cultural piece. And it's only when all of us show up at the table and we're willing to put our piece down that we can put together something that's going to be an effective solution and a path forward. And with that, I thank you. I look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thank you so much.